In this talk, I present a battery of concepts, distinctions, terminology, and questions that are common currency among philosophers of mind and language who think about intentionality. Together, they define a space of possible explanatory priorities and strategies. In addition, I'm going to sketch a systematic, interlocking set of commitments regarding the relations among these concepts and distinctions, which underwrites a distinctive set of answers to some of the most important of those questions. This normative, pragmatist, inferentialist approach to intentionality in language is much more controversial. I've developed and expounded it in a number of books over the past 2 decades. In the present context, its exposition can serve at least to illustrate how one might assemble a framework within which to think about the relations among these important issues. The contemporary philosophical use of the medieval scholastic term intentionality was introduced by Franz Brentano. His student, Edmund Husserl, recognized it as apt to characterize a phenomenon that Immanuel Kant had put at the center of our thought about mindedness, as part of what we would now call his semantic transformation of René Descartes' epistemological turn in the philosophy of mind. This is the idea of a kind of contentfulness that's distinctive of at least some of our psychological states and linguistic utterances. Brentano characterized intentionality in terms of reference to a content, direction upon an object. John Searle offers this pre-theoretical understanding of the subject matter in his book, Intentionality. He says, quote, "If a state S is intentional, then there must be an answer to the question, such as, what is S about? What is S of? What is it an S that?" End of that quote. We can specify the content of someone's belief by saying, for instance, that she believes that Lampe was Kant's faithful servant. In that case, it's a belief of or about Kant's servant Lampe, representing him as being faithful. Brentano was impressed by the thought that while things can only stand in physical or causal relations to actual existing facts, events, and objects, intentional states can refer to contents that are not true, that don't express actual facts, and be directed upon objects that do not exist. I can only kick the can if it exists, but I can think about unicorns even if they do not. We should, to begin with, distinguish intentionality in this sense from consciousness. These phenomena only overlap. For on the one hand, pain is a paradigmatically conscious phenomenon. But pains are not in the sense relevant to intentionality, contentful states or episodes. They don't have contents that could be expressed by sentential that clauses. And they're not, at least not always, about anything. On the other hand, there's nothing incoherent about the concept of unconscious beliefs, which do have intentional contents, specifiable both in terms of that and in terms of. Attributions of belief answer to 2 kinds of norms of evidence, which in some cases diverge. Evidence derived from sincere avowals by the believer license the attributions of beliefs of which the believer is conscious. But beliefs, desires, and other intentional states can also be attributed on the basis of what relatively stable beliefs and desires provide premises for bits of practical reasoning that make the most sense of what the believer actually does, even in the absence of dispositions sincerely to avow the intentional states in question. Where such intentional explanations are good explanations, the attributed intentional states are unconscious. The need to make this distinction is a manifestation of a deeper distinction between 2 sorts of mindedness, sentience and sapience. Sentience is awareness in the sense of being awake. Anything that can feel pain is sentient. Sapience is having intentionally contentful states, such as beliefs, desires, and intentions. Believing, desiring, or intending of the dog that it is sitting, will sit, or should sit. An essential element of Descartes' invention of a distinctively modern conception of the mind was his assimilation of sensations, for instance, of pain, and thoughts, for instance, that foxes are nocturnal omnivores. His predecessors had not been tempted by such an assimilation of sentience and sapience. His innovation and the rationale for the assimilation was an epistemic criterion of demarcation of the mental. Both sensations and thoughts, he took it, were transparent and incorrigible to their subject. They could not occur without the subject knowing that they occurred, and if the subject took it that they occurred, then they did. Apart from growing appreciation, beginning already with Gottfried Leibniz, of the potential explanatory significance of unconscious mental states, concerning which subjects did not have the sort of privileged access Descartes had focused on, we've also come to appreciate the importance of not prejudging issues concerning the relations between sentience and sapience. In particular, we've come to see that some of the most important issues concerning the plausibility and even the intelligibility of artificial intelligence, as classically conceived, turn precisely on the question of whether sapience presupposes sentience, which is, as far as our understanding so far reaches, an exclusively biological phenomenon. John Searle's famous Chinese room thought experiment pumps intuitions in this conceptual vicinity. Within the general area marked out by the term intentionality, there are two distinctions that it's important to keep in mind. The distinction between practical and discursive intentionality, and the distinction between propositional and representational intentionality. Practical intentionality is the sort of directedness at objects that animals exhibit when they deal skillfully with their world, the way a predator is directed at the prey it stalks, or the prey is directed at the predator it flees. It's a phenomenon of sentience, with the role objects, events, and situations can play in the lived life of an animal, providing the practical significances, is it food, is it a threat, that can be perceptually afforded. At the most abstract level of description, however, biological practical intentionality is an instance of a broader teleological directedness at objects that also has non-sentient examples. For any process that has a test-operate, test-exit feedback loop structure, where operations on an object are controlled by information about the results of previous operations on it that are repeated until some standard is satisfied, anything that exhibits this test-operate, test-exit feedback cycle behavior can be seen as in a distinctive way directed at the objects the system both operates on and is informed about. This genus includes both finite state automata executing conditional branched schedule algorithms, for instance in radar-guided tracking anti-aircraft missiles, and already in the flywheel governors that regulated the boiler pressure of the earliest steam engines. Discursive intentionality, by contrast to the practical, is that exhibited by concept users in the richest sense, those that can make judgments or claims that are about objects in a semantic sense. The paradigm of the sort of sapience that I'm calling discursive intentionality is exhibited only by language users, ones who can say what they're thinking and talking about. The second distinction between representational and propositional intentionality is that between two dimensions of content intentional states can exhibit, corresponding to two of Searle's questions that I quoted a minute ago. What is S of? What is it an S that? The answer to the first sort of question is the specification of an object represented by the state. We say, it's a belief of or about ships, or shoes, or sealing wax. Well, the answer to the second sort of question is the specification of what's believed or thought. It's the belief that ships should be seaworthy, that shoes are useful, that sealing wax is archaic. The first expresses what we're thinking or talking about, and the second, what we're thinking or saying about it. This distinction of two dimensions of contentfulness applies both to the practical and the discursive species of intentionality. The dog believes that his master is home, and he believes that of Ben, his master. The principal difficulties we have with using the terms appropriate to discursive intentionality to specify precisely the propositional contents exhibited in practical intentionality, the fact that the dog doesn't really have the concept specified by master and home, since it doesn't grasp most of the contrasts and implications essential to those concepts, that difficulty does not belie the fact that there is some content to his belief about that human, Ben, in virtue of which his belief about his master, that his master is about to feed him, differs from his belief that his master is at home or that someone else will feed him. There's two opposed orders of explanation concerning the relations between practical and discursive intentionality: pragmatism and Platonism. Pragmatism is the view that discursive intentionality is a species of practical intentionality, that knowing that things are thus and so, is a kind of knowing how to do something. What's explicit in the form of a principle is intelligible only against a background of implicit practices. The converse order of explanation, which dominated philosophy until the 19th century, is a kind of intellectualism that sees every implicit cognitive skill or propriety of practice as underwritten by a rule or a principle, something that is, or at least could be, made discursively explicit. A contemporary version of this kind of Platonism is endorsed by the program of symbolic artificial intelligence, which seeks to account for discursive intentionality as a matter of manipulating symbols according to definite rules. A contemporary version of pragmatism is endorsed by the program of pragmatic artificial intelligence, which seeks to account for discursive intentionality by finding a set of non-discursive practices, that is, practices each of which can already be exhibited by systems that display only practical intentionality, a set of non-discursive practices that can be algorithmically elaborated into autonomous discursive practices. But pragmatism need not take the reductive form of pragmatic artificial intelligence. What about the explanatory priority of the representational and propositional dimensions of intentionality? Here, too, various strategies are possible. My own approach is to give different answers depending on whether we're talking about practical or discursive intentionality. Within practical intentionality, I think the propositional dimension should be understood in terms of the representational dimension. But within discursive intentionality, I think the representational dimension should be understood in terms of the propositional. Notice that the possibility of such a view would not even be visible to a theorist who didn't make the distinctions with which I began. The sort of representation that matters for understanding practical intentionality is the mapping relation that skillful dealings produce and promote between items in the environment and states of the organism. The usefulness of map representations depends on the goodness of inferences from map facts, for instance, the fact that there's a blue wavy line between two dots here, to terrain facts, that there's a river between these two cities. The propositional content of the map facts is built up out of representational relations that are subpropositional, correlating blue lines and rivers, dots and cities. Such relations underwrite the representation to proposition order of explanation that I see happening at the level of practical intentionality. The considerations that speak for this order of explanation for practical intentionality are sometimes thought to speak for the same order of explanation for discursive intentionality. And the case could only get stronger when one conjoins that commitment with a pragmatist order of explanation relating practical and discursive intentionality. Nonetheless, I think there's strong reasons to endorse the explanatory priority of the propositional to the representational dimension of intentionality at the level of discursive intentionality. And they derive, to begin with, from consideration of the essentially normative character of discursive intentionality, to which I now turn. Kant initiated a revolution in thought about discursive intentionality. His most fundamental idea is that judgments and intentional doings are distinguished from the responses of non-discursive, natural creatures in that they're things the subject is in a distinctive way responsible for. They express commitments or endorsements. They're exercises of the authority of the subject. Responsibility, commitment, endorsement, authority, these are all normative concepts. In undertaking a theoretical or practical discursive commitment that things are or shall be thus and so, the knower or agent binds herself by rules, which Kant calls concepts. Rules that determine what she thereby becomes responsible for. For instance, in making the judgment that the coin is copper, the content of the concept copper that the subject applies determines that she's committed, whether she knows it or not, to the coin's conducting electricity and melting at 1085 degrees C, and that she's precluded from entitlement to the claim that it's less dense than water. The difference between discursive and non-discursive creatures for Kant is not, as Descartes had thought, an ontological one, the presence or absence of some unique and maybe spooky sort of mind stuff. But for Kant, it's a deontological difference, that is, a normative one, the ability to bind oneself by concepts, which are understood as a sort of rule. Where the pre-Kantian tradition had focused on our grip on concepts, is it clear, is it distinct, is it adequate? Kant focuses on their grip on us. What must one do to subject oneself to a concept in the form of a rule? He understands discursive creatures as ones who live and move and have our being in a normative space. The tradition Kant inherited pursued a bottom-up order of semantic explanation, they would have said logical explanation, that begins with concepts, particular and general, representing objects and properties. At the next level, they consider how those representations could be combined to classify each other to produce judgeable propositions of different forms. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. To the doctrine of concepts, supporting the doctrine of judgments, they then appended a third level, a doctrine of syllogisms, which classified inferences as good or bad, depending on the kind of classificatory judgments they involved. Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. This classical theory was a paradigm of the order of explanation that proceeds from the representational to the propositional dimensions of discursive intentionality. But in a radical break with tradition, Kant starts elsewhere. For him, the fundamental intentional unity, the minimal unit of experience, in the sense of sapient awareness, is the judgment, with a propositional content. For that's the minimal unit of responsibility. Concepts are to be understood top-down, by analyzing judgments. They are, Kant said, functions of judgment. Concepts are rules for judging. We're to understand them top-down, looking at what contribution they make to the responsibilities undertaken by those who bind themselves by those concepts in judgment. Kant initiated an order of explanation that moves from the propositional to the representational dimensions of discursive intentionality. Pursuing that order of explanation, in the context of his normative understanding of the propositional dimension of discursive intentionality, led Kant to a normative account also of the representational dimension of discursive normativity. On the propositional side, the concept one has applied in judgment determines what one has made oneself responsible for. On the representational side, the concept determines what one has made oneself responsible to, in the sense of what sets the standard for assessments of the correctness of the judgment. Kant sees that to treat something as a representing, as at least purporting to present something represented, is to acknowledge the authority of what is represented over assessments of the correctness of that representing. Discursive representation, too, is a normative phenomenon, and it's to be understood ultimately in terms of the contribution it makes to the normativity characteristic of propositional discursive intentionality. Contemporary philosophical analyses of the normativity characteristic of discursive intentionality along both the propositional and the representational dimensions fall into two broad classes: the social practical and the teleosemantic. Both are broadly functionalist approaches, in the sense that they look to the role discursive intentional states play in some larger system in explaining the norms they're subject to. Teleosemantic theories derive norms, what ought to follow, how the representation ought to be, from selectional, evolutionary, adaptive explanations of the advent of states and expressions that count as intentionally contentful, typically not only in the discursive but also in the practical sense, just in virtue of being governed by those norms. Ruth Millikan, for instance, defines proper functions as those functions that selectionally, that is, counterfactually, explain the persistence of a feature or structure, in the sense that if such features had not in the past performed the function, it would not have persisted. Social practice theories date to Hegel, who accepted Kant's insight into the normative character of discursive intentionality, but sought to, in a broad sense, naturalize the norms in question, which Kant had transcendentalized. Hegel understood normative statuses, such as commitment, entitlement, responsibility, and authority, as instituted by practical normative attitudes. The slogan is, all transcendental constitution is social institution. On his account, genuine norms can only be instituted socially, as he put it, by reciprocal recognition. The idea that discursive norms are to be understood as implicit in social practices was taken up from Hegel by the American pragmatists, C.S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, and later on by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who had independently discovered the normative character of discursive content. The idea is that social norms are instituted when practitioners take or treat performances as appropriate or inappropriate, take or treat each other as committed, entitled, responsible, authoritative, and so on. The pragmatist thought is that even if the norms in question are discursive norms, adopting the instituting normative attitudes might require only practical intentionality. Practically punishing or rewarding performances is one way of treating them as appropriate or inappropriate. So, for instance, hominins in a certain tribe might practically treat it as inappropriate for anyone to enter a certain hut without displaying a leaf from a rare tree, by beating with sticks anybody who attempts to do so. In virtue of the role they play in this practice, the leaves acquire the practical normative significance of hut licenses. In more sophisticated cases, the reward or punishment might itself be an alteration in normative status, regardless of the actual reinforcing effect. So, one might treat a performance as appropriate by giving the performance a hut license leaf, even if, as a matter of fact, the guy had no interest in entering the hut. Well, we should ask, what makes something a specifically discursive norm? Discursive norms are norms governing the application of concepts, paradigmatically, in judgment. Discursive norms govern the deployment of judgeable, that is, propositional intentional contents. In the context of commitment to the pragmatist order of explanation, the question then becomes, what kind of knowing how to do something amounts to knowing or believing that things are thus and so. What's the decisive difference, the difference that makes the difference, between a parrot who can reliably differentially respond to the visible presence of red things, perhaps by uttering, "Rock, that's red," on the one hand, and a human observer who can respond to the same range of stimuli by claiming and judging that something is red? What is it that the sapient, discursively intentional observer knows how to do that the merely sentient, practically intentional parrot does not? The important difference is, to be sure, a matter of a distinctive kind of understanding that the concept user evinces. The pragmatist wants to know, though, what practical abilities does this understanding consist in? We've acknowledged already the normative difference. The observer's performance does, as the parrot's does not, express an endorsement, the acknowledgement of a commitment. The key additional point to understand is that the content endorsed, the content the sapient observer is committed to, qualifies as a conceptual content, of which specifically propositional contents are a principal species, just insofar as it's situated in a space of other such contents to which it stands in relations of material consequence and incompatibility. The observer knows how to make inferences, and so draw conclusions from his commitment. He knows how to determine what else he's committed himself to by the claim that the apple is red, for instance, that it's colored, that it's ripe. He knows how to distinguish what's evidence for and against that claim, and what other commitments that rules out as incompatible. For instance, it's not being wholly green. The sapient practically understands his commitments as taking up a stance in a network of related possible commitments, which stand to one another in rational relations of material consequence and incompatibility. He's making a move in a practice of giving and asking for reasons, in which one move has normative consequences for what others are obligatory, permitted, or prohibited. Material inferential and incompatibility relations, by contrast to formal logical inferential and incompatibility relations, articulate the contents of non-logical concepts. These are inferences such as A is to the west of B, so B is to the east of A. Lightning now, so thunders soon. If the sample is copper, then it will conduct electricity. Part of what one must do to count as understanding the content of concepts such as east and west, lightning and thunder, copper and electrical conductor, is to endorse inferences just like these. Now, that's not to say that for each concept there's some meaning constitutive set of material inferences one must endorse in order to count as understanding it. But if one makes no distinction, however partial and fallible, between material inferential and incompatibility relations that do and those that do not articulate the content of some concept, then one cannot count as a competent user of that concept. Another way to get at the same point about the internal connections between conceptual contentfulness and inferential articulation is to consider the difference between labeling or classifying something on the one hand and describing it on the other. Any reliable differential responsive disposition imposes a classification on stimuli, distinguishing those that would from those that would not elicit a response of the given kind by the exercise of that reliable responsive capacity. The chunk of iron rusts in some environments and not in others. The beam breaks under some loads and not others. The parrot squawks red in some situations and not others. But what more is needed for such a performance to count not just as discriminating or labeling what it elicits it, but also as describing it as, for instance, red? The Pittsburgh philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, one of my particular heroes, offers the following inferentialist answer. He says, quote, "It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label." End of the quote. If I discover that all the boxes in the attic I'm charged with cleaning out have been labeled with red, yellow, or green stickers, all I learn is that those labeled with the same color must share some property. To learn what those labels mean is to learn, for instance, that the owner put a red label on the boxes to be discarded, a green on those to be retained, and yellow on those that needed further sorting and decision. Once I know what follows from affixing one rather than another label, I can begin to understand them not as mere labels, but as descriptions of the boxes to which they're applied. Description is classification, but it's classification with inferential consequences, either immediately practical, the box is to be discarded or kept, or a consequence for further classifications that follow from it. The inferentialist semantic claim is that what distinguishes specifically discursive, paradigmatically but not exclusively propositional commitments is that their contents are articulated by the roles they play in material, inferential, and incompatibility relations. Grasping or understanding such contents is a kind of practical know-how, distinguishing in practice what follows from a given claimable or judgeable content, what it follows from, what would be evidence for it or against it, and what it's evidence for or against. The practical inferential abilities to acknowledge the consequences of one's commitments for further commitments, both those one is committed to and those one is precluded from, and to distinguish evidence that would and would not entitle one to those commitments, are what distinguish sapience from mere sentience, creatures that exhibit discursive intentionality from those that exhibit only practical intentionality. Well, it's obvious that there can be practical intentionality without language. High-end predators, for instance, show that. But can there be discursive intentionality in the absence of language? Modern philosophers from Descartes to Kant took it to be obvious that propositionally contentful thoughts and beliefs both antedate and are in principle intelligible apart from their linguistic expression, which they understood in terms of symbols whose meanings are inherited from those antecedently prelinguistic discursive states and episodes, our thoughts. More recently, H.P. Grice extended this tradition by understanding linguistic meaning in terms of speaker's meaning, and speaker's meaning in terms of the intention of a speaker to induce a belief in the audience by an utterance accompanied by the audience's recognition that the utterance was produced with that very intention. Another prominent line of thought in the area, due to Jerry Fodor, is the claim that public language is made possible by a language of thought, much of which is innate and so does not need to be learned. A contrary order of explanation, identified with Wittgenstein among many others, gives explanatory priority to linguistic social practices in understanding discursive intentionality. Michael Dummett forcefully expresses one of the consequences of this approach when he says, quote, "We have opposed throughout the view of assertion as the expression of an interior act of judgment. Judgment, rather, is the interiorization of an external act of assertion." End of the quote. This way of turning the traditional explanatory strategy on its head is more extreme than is needed to acknowledge the crucial role of public language. Donald Davidson claims that to be a believer in the discursive sense, one must be an interpreter of the speech of others. But he also claims that, quote, "Neither language nor thinking can be fully explained in terms of the other, and neither has conceptual priority. The two are indeed linked in the sense that each requires the other in order to be understood. But the linkage is not so complete that either suffices, even when reasonably reinforced, to explicate the other." End of the quote. Although Davidson shares some important motivations with Dummett's purely linguistic theory, in fact, these two views illustrate an important difference between two ways in which one might give prominence to linguistic practice in thinking about discursive intentionality. Davidson's claim, by contrast to Dummett's, serves to epitomize a relational view of the significance of language for sapience. taking it that concept use is not intelligible in a context that does not include language use, but not insisting that linguistic practices can be made sense of without appeal at the same time to intentional states such as belief. According to such relational views, the transition from mere sentience to sapience, from practical to discursive intentionality, is effected by coming into language, coming to participate in discursive, social, linguistic practices. The capacity to think in the discursive sense, that is, to have propositionally or conceptually contentful thoughts, to be able to think that things are thus and so, a matter of knowing that and not just knowing how, and the capacity to talk arise and develop together. For Wittgenstein, the essentiality of public language to the capacity for individual thought is a consequence of the normativity of discursive intentionality. He endorsed a pragmatist order of explanation that understands discursive norms as, in the first instance, implicit in social practices, uses, customs, institutions, he also said. The capacity to make propositionally explicit claims and have conceptually contentful thoughts is intelligible only in the context of implicitly normative social linguistic practices. An inferentialist about discursive content, who understands discursive norms as implicit in social linguistic practice and holds a relational view of the priority of language and thought, will take it that the core of discursive intentionality is to be found in the role declarative sentences play in expressing propositional contents in speech acts of assertion. This connection between the syntactic category of declarative sentences, the semantic category of propositions, and the pragmatic category of assertions is the iron triangle of discursiveness. A pragmatist about the relations between them takes it that the syntactic and semantic elements are ultimately to be understood in terms of the pragmatic one. It's their role in the practice of assertion, of claiming that things are thus and so, that's appealed to in picking out declarative sentences and propositional contents. Propositional contents are what can both serve as and stand in need of reasons. That is, can perform the office both of premise and of conclusion in inferences. So, the inferentialist pragmatist takes it that what distinguishes the speech act of assertion is its role in practices of giving and asking for reasons. One way of putting together a social normative pragmatics and an inferential semantics for discursive intentionality is to think of linguistic practices in terms of Deontic scorekeeping. Normative statuses show up as social statuses. The paradigmatic Deontic status is commitment. And the idea is that we should understand what one's doing in making an assertion as undertaking a distinctive kind of commitment. Making a claim is staking a claim. If acquiring the status of being committed in the way standardly undertaken by assertion, by assertively uttering the sentence P, is to be significant, it must have consequences. The inferentialist says to look for the inferential consequences, what else one becomes committed to by asserting P, what follows from P, and also what would commit one to it, what it follows from. The pragmatist says that to understand that in terms of what one is obliged or permitted to do upon asserting P. To understand an assertional speech act is to know how to keep score on the commitments the speaker has undertaken by performing that act. In undertaking commitment to the sentence P, the asserter has obliged herself to acknowledge other commitments, those that follow from it. And she's also authorized other interlocutors to attribute that commitment to her. Further, she's obliged herself to offer a justification, to give reasons for her claim, if her authority is suitably challenged. The idea is that exercising such inferentially articulated authority and fulfilling such inferentially articulated responsibility is what one must do. It's the task responsibility one must carry out in order to count as responsible for or committed, not now to do something, but to what in this social practical scorekeeping context shows up as the propositional content expressed by the sentence P. For such an idealized assertional practice to count as one of giving and asking for reasons, there must be a difference between commitments for which one can give a reason, so fulfilling one's justificatory task responsibility, and those for which one cannot. That is, there must be a distinction between commitments to which an asserter is, rationally, inferentially, by one's evidence, entitled, and those to which the asserter is not entitled. So, in practice, to take or treat a performance as an assertion of a particular propositional content by uttering a declarative sentence, other interlocutors must keep track not only of how that performance changes the score of what the asserter is committed to, but also of what she and others are entitled to. Discursive scorekeeping, then, requires attributing two sorts of deontic normative status: commitments and entitlements. Entitlements to commitments. And knowing how different speech acts change the deontic scores of various interlocutors, who may become entitled to new commitments by relying on the authority of other asserters, to whom they can then defer their justificatory responsibility. This deontic scorekeeping story is a sketch of how discursive intentionality is intelligible as emerging from exercises of practical intentionality if they have the right normative and social structure. Scorekeepers acknowledging and attributing two kinds of normative deontic status, commitments and entitlements, can distinguish three kinds of practical consequential relations among them, which generate in turn three flavors of inferential relations and a relation of incompatibility. Scorekeepers who take anyone who's entitled to P to be at least prima facie entitled to Q thereby practically endorse a permissive inferential, probatively evidential relation between P and Q. This is a generalization from the formal logical to the contentful material case of inductive inference. The barometer is falling, so there will be a storm. Scorekeepers who take anyone who's committed to P to be committed to Q thereby practically endorse a committive, inferential, dispositive evidential relation between P and Q. This is a generalization from the formal logical to the contentful material case of deductive inference. If the sample is pure copper, it will conduct electricity. Scorekeepers who practically take or treat anyone who's committed to P not to be entitled to Q, and vice versa, thereby treat the two claims they express as materially incompatible. The plane figure cannot be both square and circular. Scorekeepers for whom everything incompatible with Q is incompatible with P thereby practically take or treat Q as incompatibility entailed by P. Everything incompatible with Pedro being a mammal is incompatible with Pedro being a donkey. So Pedro being a donkey, in this sense, entails Pedro being a mammal. This third kind of inference are modally robust, counterfactual supporting entailments. When an interlocutor makes an assertion by uttering P, scorekeepers take or treat him as also committed to committive consequences of P. They withdraw entitlements to any claims incompatible with P, and if they take it that he's also entitled to P, attribute further entitlements to its permissive consequences to him and to anyone in the audience not precluded from that by virtue of their incompatible commitments. Adopting this sort of practical deontic scorekeeping attitude is what those who appreciate the practical significance of the speech act must do in order thereby to count as implicitly taking or treating the utterance as playing the functional role of assertion, the role in virtue of which it expresses a propositional discursive content. Other uses of language are built on this assertional inferential core, the downtown of language, and they make use of the conceptual contents conferred by it. This inferentialist social practical story about the structure of practical intentionality, knowing how, abilities, how that can add up to discursive intentionality, knowing or believing that things are thus and so, presents an approach to pragmatics, the theory of the use of the language, the norms implicit in scorekeeping practices. And according to that story, expressions come to have propositional, discursive, semantic content, paradigmatically the propositional, but conceptual content in general, and so are able to make something explicit in the sense of its being sayable, claimable, thinkable, in virtue of being practically taken or treated as standing in functional relations of material inference and incompatibility. And then building on this kind of basic, discursive, sapient intentional practices and abilities, it's also possible for such practitioners to make propositionally explicit those normative material inferential and incompatibility relations which are initially implicit in the practical attitudes discursive scorekeepers adopt to one another. Most centrally, inferential, including material inferential relations, can be put in claimable, that is, propositional, explicit form by the use of logical conditional locutions. One can explicitly express one's endorsement of the inference from P to Q by asserting the conditional, if P, then Q. Also, incompatibility relations can be made explicit using logical negation operators. One can explicitly express one's taking P to be incompatible with Q by asserting not P and Q. Conditional and negation operators are logical vocabulary. Indeed, versions of them suffice to define the classical propositional calculus. The expressive role characteristic of logical vocabulary is to make explicit the material, inferential, and incompatibility relations in virtue of which non-logical vocabulary expresses the semantic content it does. It's by playing the role they do in a network of such relations that expressions acquire the propositional content that makes possible the discursive sapient awareness that consists in explicitly claiming or judging that things are thus and so. Logical vocabulary makes explicit discursive sapient awareness of those very semantogenic material, inferential, and incompatibility relations. Logic, I'm saying, is the organ of semantic self-consciousness. On this account of the expressive role that demarcates vocabulary as distinctively logical vocabulary, it's entirely intelligible that there should be creatures that are rational but not yet logical. To be rational is to engage in practices of giving and asking for reasons, that is, making inferentially articulated assertions and justifying them. To do that, one must attribute and acknowledge commitments and entitlements and practically keep track of their inferential relations among all three dimensions that those two Deontic statuses generate, the permissive, committive, and incompatibility entailments. But one need not yet deploy specifically logical vocabulary, which permit one to make explicit and so be discursively aware of those material, inferential, and incompatibility relations. In being rational, one always already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do to introduce logical vocabulary. But until such semantically explicitating vocabulary actually is deployed, rational creatures need not be semantically self-conscious, that is, logical creatures. We're not like that. We do use logic, but our hominin ancestors might not have been. They may have been rational without being logical. Practically keeping track of inferentially articulated commitments and entitlements, that is, engaging in discursive practices, requires distinguishing between the normative statuses one attributes to another and those one acknowledges oneself. This distinction of social perspective between normative attitudes means that there are always 2 points of view from which one can assess another's consequential commitments. For the auxiliary hypotheses or collateral premises that one conjoins to another's avowed commitments to extract its consequences, whether the permissive, committive, or incompatibility entailed consequences, can be drawn either from other commitments one attributes to that interlocutor or from those one undertakes oneself. Suppose S attributes to A commitment to the claim, Benjamin Franklin was a printer. If S also attributes to A commitment to Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of the lightning rod, then S should also attribute to A commitment to the inventor of the lightning rod was a printer. But suppose it's S but not A who's committed to Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of bifocals. Should S then attribute to A commitment to the inventor of bifocals was a printer? Given the fact that, as S takes it, Franklin invented bifocals, that is indeed a consequence of A's original claim. In the context of that fact, a claim about Ben Franklin is a claim about the inventor of bifocals, whether or not A realizes that. So in a genuine and important sense, A, who knows that Benjamin Franklin was a printer, but doesn't know that he was the inventor of bifocals, has, without knowing it, committed herself to the inventor of bifocals having been a printer. But that's a different sense from that in which A has committed herself to the inventor of the lightning rod having been a printer. When the practical adoption of a normative attitude of attributing a commitment to another interlocutor is made propositionally explicit by the use of locutions that let one say what commitments one practically attributes to another, this difference in social perspective manifests itself in 2 different kinds of ascription of propositional attitude. Consequential commitments attributed solely on the basis of commitments the target would assert are ascribed, as the medieval scholastics said, de dicto. S can say, A claims that the inventor of the lightning rod was a printer. But consequential commitments, attributed partly on the basis of commitments the target would assert, and partly by the use of collateral premises that the attributor, but not the target of the attribution, would assert, are ascribed, as the scholastics said, de re. S can say, A claims of the inventor of bifocals that he was a printer. In putting things this way, S marks that while he's attributing to A responsibility for the overall claim, S is himself undertaking responsibility for the substitution inference licensed by the identity, Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of bifocals, a commitment which he does not attribute to A. Propositional attitude ascribing locutions, such as claims and believes, let their users make explicit their practical normative scorekeeping attitudes of attributing commitments. That is, using such vocabulary empowers them to say that they adopt such attitudes, which otherwise would remain implicit in what they practically do, in the way they keep score. Performing this expressive office with respect to social normative attitudes on the side of pragmatics marks them as another species of the same explicitating genus as logical vocabulary, which does corresponding service on the semantic side by making explicit inferential commitments. What S is doing in making de re ascriptions is expressing the distinction of social perspective between commitments attributed, Benjamin Franklin was a printer, and those undertaken, Benjamin Franklin invented bifocals. But what one is saying is what the one to whom the commitments are ascribed is talking about. That is, de re ascriptions of propositional attitude are the home language game of representational locutions, the ones used to make explicit what one is talking or thinking of or about. That is, what they make explicit is the representational dimension of discursive intentionality. That representational dimension is always already implicit in the distinction of social perspective that's integral to keeping track of others' inferentially articulated commitments. For discursive Deontic scorekeepers, players of the game of giving and asking for reasons, care about what follows from others' claims, but for two different kinds of reason. They care about the consequential commitments that would be ascribed de dicto because they want to know what else the target would endorse and what she'll do based on the commitments she acknowledges. They care about the consequential commitments that would be ascribed de re because they want to extract information from the claims of others. That is, claims the attributor can use as premises in her own inferences. If S attributes to A the intention to shoot a deer and the belief that that tawny creature in front of her is a deer, the de dicto ascription, A believes that the tawny creature in front of her is a deer, the shooting of which would fulfill her intention, S is in a position to predict that A will shoot. But if S, but not A, believes that the tawny creature in front of A is a cow, S will predict perhaps that A will also shoot. But S's de re ascription, A believes of the cow in front of her that it's a deer, the shooting of which would fulfill her intention. On that basis, S will predict not only that A will shoot, but that the result of A's action will be the shooting of a cow. That's an inference that S is in a position to extract from A's avowed commitments, even though that information was not available to A. Keeping track of what premises are available for the reasoning of others and what premises are available for our own reasoning is what we're doing when we talk or think about what we're talking or thinking about. That is, those de re ascriptions of propositional attitude make explicit the representational dimension of discursive intentionality. And I've suggested how it can be understood in terms of the social normative inferential articulation of the more basic propositional dimension of discursive intentionality. Thank you for your attention.